Thank you, Tom. So the topic of this has been something that I've thought about for the last 20 years. And, you know, when you go to psychology school, one of the things that happens is you soon realize that you start to study the stuff that you're uncomfortable in yourself about. And so, yeah, this has been a lifelong journey for me to come to be more self-compassionate and to embrace my inner critic. We'll talk more about that. So there's a lot of writing about this, self-compassion. And most of the writing that's been out there for 1,500, 2,000 years comes from the Buddhist tradition. It's just, just recently in the last 30 years, Western science has said, hey, I think they got something there. Maybe we should take a look at that. And it's interesting when Western science comes in and takes a look at it. It makes you kind of think about it differently. So let's just make sure I'm on common ground. How many of you, maybe, if you're brave enough to raise your hand, have ever, I don't know, made a misstep, a mistake, and then, hold on, that's not the question. That's not the question. The question, well, I know y'all do that. The next part is, and then how many of you have sat for probably too long, kind of criticizing yourself, punishing yourself, second-guessing yourself? Yeah. Okay. So some of you may know, I think most of you know, but if you don't, I'm a psychologist. I have a practice in town, and I've seen people, I don't know, for the last, let's see, 1990, what is that, about 7 years, something like that, right? And I must say that this has been quite a theme in all the pathology I've seen. Yes, there's diagnoses. There's Asperger's disorder, there's depression, there's anxiety, there's bipolar, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? But yeah, those are real. We can kind of separate those out. But what I find is that one of the things that people struggle with most is this idea of cutting themselves some slack, for lack of a better word, right? And I don't know if it's a cultural thing for us or what, but I certainly see that it's almost epidemic how critical and harsh we can be on ourselves. We have an inner critic, right? Okay. And your inner critic can cause you great suffering. But is the goal to get rid of your inner critic? What would life be like without some kind of reflective, critical thought about your own actions, your decisions, and how you move in relationships? So this sermon it is about becoming more self-compassionate, but it's not about annihilating or getting rid of your inner critic. Rather, I would ask you to get to know it. Let it come. Be non-judgmental with it. Try to understand it. In the opening hymn, we are a house. We talked about all the things that visit you in thoughts and emotions. Okay? That's all of who we are. We're human. And part of who we are is we tend to get critical with ourselves. Kristen Neff is a researcher at the University of Texas in Austin, and I think she got her PhD at Cal Berkeley. And she's been researching self-compassion for the past probably 15 years. One of my favorite quotes of hers is, unlike self-criticism, which asks if you're good enough, self-compassion asks, what's good for you? What do you need? What do I need in this moment? So let me talk about the critic a little bit, our inner critic. As I said, it's a source of great suffering. It's a series of negative evaluations of yourself. It is a narrative that I think we all know too well that can go off pretty automatically at the slightest provocation. It can go off at a big mistake where maybe you cause someone harm. But it can go off in small mistakes like, I announced the wrong hymn. Okay. But it causes great suffering. And the good news is that that narrative, that negative evaluation that you all have, you've rehearsed it. And I would submit to you that you do it unconsciously without it even being aware when it's on board. Is an optional activity. Okay. So the psychologist part of me has to talk about the brain a little bit. All right? So our brain is an organ. It's a great organ. But it has a function, just like our liver and our heart and everything else. It processes information, and it does it exquisitely well. And it does it all the time. And you're doing it right now. Your brains are. You're processing what I'm saying, but you're processing probably on 5 or 6 or 7 different tracks, other information that's coming in right now that you're not aware of. So your brain processes information. And what it does is it looks for patterns. It looks for things that reoccur. It looks for things that might go wrong. So in neurology, there's a saying said, you know, the neurons, those are the cells that make up your brain. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Okay, how many times in your life have you been caught in the trance of this self-negative narrative over and over and over? There's probably a neural network laid down in your fiber that easily accessed and easily gets kicked off. That's sad, I guess, isn't it? But the good news is that although we don't develop more neurons, we develop more connections. And what you practice actually has a physical effect in your brain. So what would it be like if you were to practice on a regular basis being self-compassionate with yourself, cutting yourself slack? When you notice your mistakes and you want to offer yourself some critical feedback, well, offer the critical feedback you would give to someone else that you love and respect to yourself. Do we do that naturally? It's amazing that we don't do that. Right? What's the golden rule in Christianity? Treat others, do unto others like you would have them do unto you. God, what if it read, do unto others as you do unto yourself? Right? Okay. All right, so a little bit more about this critic and this narrative of unworthiness. Okay, Tara Brock is a social worker by training, but really she's quite a teacher in mindfulness meditation. So she uses more of those terms than maybe the scientific terms, but she calls it a trance, the trance of unworthiness. I call it, this is your neural network that easily gets triggered and goes off over and over. But nonetheless, it hijacks your brain and sets you off into a critical stance with yourself. What impact does that have on you? My gosh, you know, we can go on and on, right? When we start to get self-critical, self-evaluative of ourselves, we disconnect from people. We turn inward. We pull away. We start comparing ourselves to people, and that in itself is a way of separating yourself from people instead of truly connecting. I'm not as good as them. Some of the things your inner critic might say, I'm not good enough the way I am. I'm bad because I made a little mistake. I need to fix myself. I'm not lovable because someone was unable to love me. You know, these, you know, if I say them out loud, you can say, oh yeah, those are rational. Your rational brain said, oh, those are, you know, we can see the truth in that. But I challenge you to bring that awareness to your own thoughts and your own patterns, your own relationship with yourself. Well, so where does a inner critical voice come from? You know, well, there's probably a lot of ways that can develop, right? We could have had a parent that maybe was critical of us, okay? That could happen, right? And was unable to do that good mirroring that kind of turns us back on our own essential goodness, you know? The kind of parenting that says, it's going to be okay. Yeah, you messed up, but you're good. That's your essential goodness, right? Why can't we do that with ourselves? There's other ways it can happen. I mean, there can be trauma in your life, right? And you can internalize that trauma and feel very damaged, unworthy. And the trauma can be a big traumatic event. It could be a huge string of microaggressions in the form of racism. We can go on and on about where this critic comes from. And it's, you know, most people when they come in and we start talking about this, they want to know where, why, how did it get here? And you know, I can just tell you, you can find out why and where, and then what? Right? But I understand the people that want to go back and do that. So I'll sit with people and help them try to explore where and that came from. My theory is that there are these various ways that it can develop, but that the main way it develops, and maybe this is just me projecting onto the world because it's how it developed for me. I had great parents. Some of you have met my parents. They're loving people. But I have this huge internal critic. I mean, it's so bad sometimes that, you know, I'll stand up in front of a class I'm teaching, or I'll be in a session and I'll be, man, what if they find out that I really don't know what the heck I'm talking about? And you laugh because that's familiar to you, right? All right? But there's suffering in that. There's suffering in that. So anyway, what I was going to say is how it came for me in my life was my mother, wonderful lady, very social, but oh my gosh, does she have this internal critic of her own. And she didn't put it out on me. You know, I think I was pretty cherished and everything. But guess what? She modeled that for me. All right, so going back to my brain stance, humans are wired from the get-go, from tiny babies, to read faces, to pick up emotions, to see intent, right? And that's all done very subtly, right? And so I think the majority of what our children learn, I might be out on a limb compared to other people, but I think it's really through modeling. I mean, I think it's great that we have sit-downs and we talk to our kids, right? We try to teach them lessons, and that's all good. And we give them consequences, that stuff's all good. But really what they learn from us is what they see and what is modeled. I remember my mom, we had she's very cultural and very artistic. And we lived in a small town in Wyoming, Green River, Wyoming. And this is Redneckville, okay? And she wanted to have a night of distinction at the church. My father's a minister. I don't know if I shared that with you. And so she was going to organize this night of distinction at the church. And, you know, we had local artists that were going to show their beautiful paintings. We had people reading poetry. We had people playing. We had Chris Levente, who ran the Teton Cafe, who thought he was a gourmet chef, was going to cook a gourmet meal, right, for the place. So she was going all out, man. And I just remember that process, You know, some of you are quite the planners in here, and thank you so much for that. Okay, thank you. Okay. But you know what it's like to plan a big event like that, right? Some stuff starts coming together, and then all of a sudden something doesn't, So I think the string quartet, last minute, backed out, right? And, her response to that was suffering. I just remember watching my mom just, first of all, cussing like you wouldn't believe, and I won't say those things up here. And then just kind of turning inward and, what am I going to do? I should have known that this might have happened. I don't have a backup plan. Tears, okay. But that's one example, and that was modeled over and over for me, and I think I just internalized it. Is there any good thing about your internal critic? What do you guys think? Yeah, I think so, right? So I don't think you should lose it, right? Because it's pretty important, right? It's pretty important to kind of make a mistake and have some remorse about it and think about what you could do differently, right? But, there's two types of shame. I think, was that author Bradshaw? He was a writer about family and family dynamics in the 90s. And he made this distinction between healthy shame and toxic shame. And toxic shame goes like this. I made a mistake. I screwed up. I'm bad. I'm stupid. Do you see how that shifts? Healthy shame is, oh, I feel bad. I made a mistake. I hurt right now. I hope I can act more skillfully in the future. You see the difference? Okay. Kristen Neff, who I mentioned in the beginning, is a researcher for self-compassion. And if you listen to some of her talks, she has some great talks on YouTube. But she suggests that self-compassion is a skill. And that if it's a skill, that means that if you practice it, you get better at it, right? Okay. And that she also asserts that this is not something that our culture teaches, right? So you think about this, think about the own blocks that come up to you when I start talking about how could you be kind, loving, caring to yourself. How could you hold your hands up to your chest when you're suffering and say, it's going to be okay, sweetheart, I love you. Okay, that's pretty touchy-feely, right? Okay, what are some of the intellectual blocks that come up when I say that to you, right? That's weak. But how am I going to take responsibility for something if I don't feel ashamed? That's a myth, that you have to feel ashamed to take responsibility. That's a myth. Okay, we can feel shame, but ashamed. How will I ever get better at something? If you ever, another kind of insidious way your internal critic starts working on you, because remember, it's scanning you for what's wrong and how you need to be better, right? That's what it does. Okay, have you ever been under the tyranny of a self-improvement project? Yeah. Right. You think about that, right? We all know, let's say it's weight, right? We all know that our inner critic can move us to watch what we eat, to move us to do that extra mile, right? But think of the way in which it's doing it with you, right? It's that you're not good enough. Keep going. You can do better. You can strive higher. This is striving. In the mindfulness meditation, they talk about striving. Striving, one of the ways you become self-compassionate is you let go of striving. Because you think if you let go of it, you're not going to try to improve yourself. But that's another myth, right? So we all know that, with weight loss, it's, for example, it's, planful, slow self-care, built-in habits over time is what gets us in the right direction versus, restriction, right? You can lose, it's pretty easy to lose a lot of weight rapidly. It just doesn't stay off, right? Okay. Well, so let's talk about compassion. Right? So Western sciences have now studied this, right? And so when you can begin to measure something, you can then begin to study and tweak it and see what it correlates with, and and the measures in my field are imperfect, but psychologists are really good at standardizing things and taking a good whack at it, right? So they're not like the ones you read in those magazines, these are standardized. And so Kristen Neff has you can rate yourself on self-compassion. You can go to her website, and it's free. But I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to read a couple things to you. And it'll get you thinking about what correlates with more regular self-compassion. So you're supposed to rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being never, 5 being all the time, and 3 being 50% of the time, okay? Right. And this is standardized and been cross-validated, okay? Let's see. I'm disapproving and judgmental about my own flaws and inadequacies. And then you rate yourself, right? Okay? When I fail at something important to me, I become consumed by feelings of inadequacy. When I'm feeling down, I tend to feel like most other people are probably happier than I am. And there's that separation. Being really critical begins to separate you from people. And it turns out, when you're self-compassionate, lo and behold, you start to become more connected to people around you. There's plenty of research to show that. I try to see my failings as part of the human condition. I try to be understanding and patient towards those aspects of my personality that I don't like. Okay. That's a smattering of that. So, people that rate higher on this scale report higher ratings of just well-being, and that's both physical health and mental health. People that rate higher on self-compassion tend to be more active in their communities. People that rate themselves higher in self-compassion and care about themselves tend to be resilient. Instead of quitting when they make a mistake, they tend to accept the suffering and the pain that caused, but then try to figure out what they can do about it. So there's great benefits here. Why don't we do it? Why don't we teach it? Why don't we practice it? I have another quote here I want to read to you. Where is it? Oh, I know where it is. It's here. This is from a book. This is an old book. It's called Living Your Heart Wide Open, and it's by two teachers in mindfulness meditation, Steve Flowers and Bob Stahl. I do a retreat with them every year. And this is Steve Flowers, who says, "Be gentle with yourself. Be kind to yourself. You may not be perfect, but you are all you've got to work with. The process of becoming who you will be begins first with the total acceptance of who you are. And that is, the parts that you don't necessarily like about yourself, right? The jiggly parts, the the shortcomings. Okay. All right. So there's plenty of things out there on practices you can develop about self-compassion. And I tried to just introduce you to some of the benefits that are there for you. Okay. But for a moment, what I thought I would do is I'd just lead you in one exercise of self-compassion. Okay? And you can join this or not. It's totally up to you, right? Okay, so if you're comfortable, close your eyes for a moment. And take maybe a couple of deep breaths, and as you exhale, see if you can let your soft body settle down into the chair, even just slightly further than it was. Now what I'll ask you to do is just bring back some memory of when you were self-critical, perhaps suffering. And it can be something little or big, something recent or in the past. And as that comes up, I want you to just be curious. I want you to not make any actions towards it. In fact, the only action I'd like you to make is invite it in. And because our minds and our bodies are exquisitely intertwined with this amazing network of neurons, key into the felt sense of that, the feeling in your body that's connected to the memory of that. Some of you might notice that your critic might even have started already. Might make yourself feel browbeaten. There might be shame that comes up. Take your two hands and place them over the middle of your chest. And for many people, this is a move of comfort and soothing, and you might even notice that physiologically in you as you do that. And in your mind's eye, your mind's voice, tell yourself that you care about yourself. I know that you're suffering or you suffered. It's going to be okay. It hurts. You wish you hadn't, but it happened. And if you're able, sometimes using a term of endearment is quite helpful. Dear one, I love you. Now take a deep, deep breath. Come back to this room, to this place with these beautiful people around you. And try to treat yourself as you possibly sometime during this week, the way that the person next to you would treat you today. You know that if you turn next to someone and you said, I really messed this up, you know what they're going to say to you. All right, so we'll go into our next hymn now. It's hymn number 18, What Wondrous Love Is This? If you're willing and able, you can stand and join us.